The silence in the apartment was the loudest sound Helen had ever heard. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a hollow, echoing void where life used to be. The ghosts of furniture left faint squares on the dusty floor, specters of a life that had been dismantled and sold piece by piece. 6 months. It had only been 6 months since the phone call that shattered her world, the one about the accident at the construction site. Now, the only sound was the frantic, panicked thumping of her own heart in her ears and the rustle of the bright orange eviction notice taped to the front door, whispering threats with every cold draft that seeped through the frame. She felt a familiar, icy knot form in her stomach, a constant companion of grief and fear. Her hands were cold, clammy, and she wrapped her arms around herself, a useless gesture against the chill that came not from the Pittsburgh air, but from the marrow of her bones. The smell of dust and finality was thick, a perfume of failure that made her want to gag. She was 45 years old, and her life was a hollowed-out room. Every object in this empty space screamed of her late husband, Mark. She could still see him sitting on the sofa they'd sold for $50, laughing at some silly show on a television they'd sold for $20, a construction worker with strong, calloused hands, and a laugh that could fill any room. He was the bedrock of their world. Then a fatal fall, a tangle of corporate negligence, and the cruel punchline, no life insurance. The company called it a tragedy. For Helen, it was a 6-month-long avalanche. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. But the poverty that followed was a different kind of monster, a slow-moving predator that stalked them relentlessly. She felt a wave of nausea, the same she'd felt at the funeral, as the reality crashed over her again. The man she loved was gone, and he had taken their future with him. All that was left was the crushing weight of his absence and the terrifying vulnerability of being utterly alone. The process of selling their life had been a series of small, excruciating deaths. First went the car, then Mark's tools, each piece a memory of his hands. Then the dining table where their 10-year-old son, Lucas, did his homework. She remembered the look on the buyer's face, a mix of pity and impatience, as she wiped it down one last time, her tears mixing with the cleaning spray. The hardest to let go of was her sewing machine, the heavy, reliable singer that had been her trade and her solace. Watching a stranger haul it away felt like an amputation. She was a seamstress with no machine, a mother with no home, a wife with no husband. Each transaction chipped away at her identity until she felt transparent. She could feel the ghost of the machine's pedal under her foot, a phantom limb of a life she could no longer access. The sting of tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford. Now it all came down to a pathetic little pile on the kitchen counter, the last stand against total destitution. A small stack of worn bills and a handful of coins. She counted it for the 10th time, her fingers trembling slightly as she separated the wrinkled paper. $250. That was the sum total of a shared life, of 2 decades of work and love. $250, 2 well-worn suitcases packed with only the essentials, and her son, Lucas, sitting quietly on the floor in the corner, trying to be small, trying not to be a burden. His silence was worse than any crying. It was the sound of a child forcing himself to be an adult, and the sight of it sent a spear of guilt straight through Helen's heart. Her stomach didn't just hurt from hunger anymore. It ached with the sharp, acidic pain of dread. They were standing on the edge of a cliff, and the ground was crumbling beneath their feet. The harsh, metallic scrape of a key in the lock of the front door made them both flinch. It was the landlord. The final deadline had arrived. Helen felt the air leave her lungs in a short, sharp gasp as the lock turned with a definitive, brutal click. They were officially locked out, trapped inside with nowhere to go. A wave of pure, primal terror washed over her, cold and suffocating. Her only thought was of Lucas, his small face pale in the dim light. She was his mother, his protector, and she had failed him completely. Through the thin door, she could hear the indifferent sounds of the hallway, a distant TV, a neighbor's footsteps, a world that was moving on without them. But for Helen and Lucas, huddled in the empty apartment, the world had just ended. Homelessness was no longer an abstract fear. It was a locked door. It was the chilling wind outside. It was here. Just as the crushing weight of the locked door settled upon them, a different sound cut through the silence. The shrill, insistent ringing of her cheap, prepaid cell phone. It was a number she didn't recognize, with a West Virginia area code. She answered with a trembling hand, her voice a dry rasp. The man on the other end was a lawyer, his tone professional and detached, utterly alien to the raw panic consuming her. He spoke of a great uncle she never knew existed, a man named Arthur, a reclusive park ranger. He spoke of a will, an inheritance. The words seemed like a cruel joke, a phantom echo from a different reality. He said, "He left you his only property, ma'am, a cabin and the land it sits on in the Appalachian woods." The words hung in the suffocating air of the empty apartment, a strange and unbelievable lifeline thrown into the abyss. Helen felt a wild, painful flutter in her chest. Hope. It was a sensation so foreign it almost hurt. A cabin, a roof. It didn't matter what it was. It was something. There was a place to go that wasn't a homeless shelter or the cold, indifferent streets of Pittsburgh. She looked at Lucas, who had been watching her, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning curiosity. A sliver of a child's optimism pierced through his quiet despair. For him, she had to believe. The lawyer's final words sealed their fate. "It's all yours, ma'am. The property and everything on it." In that moment, with the landlord's key turning on the other side of the door, there was no other choice. This was their only path forward, a blind leap into the unknown. The decision wasn't made. It was forced upon them by the sheer absence of any other option. She felt a surge of adrenaline that temporarily numbed the hunger pains in her stomach. The last of their money, the pathetic $250, now had a purpose. It wasn't for food or a motel room for a few nights. It was for a one-way ticket to a ghost of a relative's home. She spent an hour on the phone, her voice tight and strained, negotiating with a budget truck rental company. She chose the smallest, oldest vehicle they had, the one no one else wanted. The sound of the metallic door of the 10-foot truck slamming shut on their 2 suitcases and a couple of threadbare blankets was a deafening, final punctuation mark on their Pittsburgh life. The acrid smell of old exhaust fumes and cheap stale coffee from the truck's cab filled her nostrils. It was the scent of a desperate gamble, the perfume of last chances. As Helen pulled the hulking, clumsy truck away from the curb, the city lights of their past blurred into streaks of indifferent color through the grimy windshield. Each passing street sign was a ghost, a memory of a life that no longer belonged to them. She gripped the worn steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, a physical anchor against the storm of emotions raging inside her. Terror and a strange, manic exhilaration warred within her chest. For the first time in 6 agonizing months, they weren't just running away from eviction and hunger. They were driving toward something. Lucas sat silently in the passenger seat, his small face illuminated by the passing streetlights, his gaze fixed on the unfolding road ahead. The monotonous, low hum of the truck's struggling engine was the only sound between them, a droning lullaby for their exodus. The dense urban sprawl of Pittsburgh slowly bled away, replaced by the gentle, rolling hills of the countryside. Soon, those hills swelled into the ancient, imposing peaks of the Appalachian Mountains. The air itself seemed to transform, losing its city grit and taking on a heavy, primal scent of damp earth, pine needles, and something wild and untamed. The highway narrowed, twisting and turning like a serpent through the dense, dark woods. The late afternoon sun struggled to penetrate the thick canopy of leaves overhead, casting long, eerie shadows that danced and writhed across the asphalt. A profound sense of isolation began to press in on Helen from all sides. The sheer, silent scale of the wilderness was intimidating, and the fragile hope that had bloomed in her heart began to be tinged with a cold, creeping anxiety. The further they drove, the more the wilderness seemed to swallow them whole. The paved road gave way to a rough gravel track, and the sound of the truck's tires crunching over the loose stones was unnervingly loud in the profound silence of the forest. They passed a rusty, bullet-riddled sign for a town they had left behind nearly an hour ago. The lawyer's directions, hastily scribbled on a stained napkin, felt less like a map and more like a passage into oblivion. Helen's stomach, already empty, churned with a nauseating blend of hunger and rising dread. The hope she had clung to for the past 100 miles began to wither under the oppressive weight of the endless trees. A cold, sickening suspicion started to form in her mind. They had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. The old truck groaned and shuddered with every pothole, its complaints echoing her own internal turmoil. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spotted it, a dirt track, almost completely consumed by weeds and undergrowth, that matched the final turn on the lawyer's map. The truck's sides scraped loudly against low-hanging branches, a sound like fingernails clawing at a coffin lid. The path was treacherous, more of a muddy suggestion than a road. Then, through a break in the trees, they saw it, the cabin. The word itself had conjured images in her mind. Rustic, perhaps, maybe small but sturdy, a safe haven. The reality that stood before her was so grotesque, so utterly devastating, that it stole the air from her lungs. A choked, silent sob caught in her throat. It was a ruin, a skeleton being devoured by the forest. It wasn't just neglected, it was a structure in the active process of surrendering to nature. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine, a gaping hole torn open to the grey, unforgiving sky. Weather-beaten shingles lay scattered on the damp ground like broken teeth. The front porch had rotted and collapsed on one side, its splintered timbers bleached a ghostly grey. Every window was shattered, leaving dark, vacant eyes that stared blankly into the oppressive woods. Helen switched off the truck's engine, and a sudden, crushing silence descended. It was a silence so absolute, it felt like a physical presence, broken only by the mournful, high-pitched whistle of the wind, blowing through the broken glass. Hope didn't just fade, it was violently extinguished, replaced by a black, suffocating despair. Forcing her trembling legs to move, she stepped out of the truck. The air that hit her was a physical assault. It was thick and heavy with the overpowering stench of rot, not just damp wood, but a deep, pervasive smell of mold, wet earth, and animal decay that coated the back of her throat. The ground beneath her feet was soft and spongy, saturated with moisture. Thorny vines and thick weeds crawled relentlessly up the cabin walls, as if the forest were actively pulling the structure down into its embrace. A wave of intense dizziness washed over her, and she had to grab the cold metal of the truck's door to keep from collapsing. This wasn't a new beginning. It was a grave. This wasn't a lifeline. It was an anchor, dragging them down into a new, deeper level of hell. Lucas climbed out of the truck behind her, his small voice, thin and fragile in the vast silence, cut through her stupor. "Mum, is this it?" The raw, childish disbelief in his question shattered what little composure Helen had left. She couldn't form a word. She could only stare at the dilapidated shack, the monument to her failure. A fresh surge of guilt, hot and sharp as a knife, twisted in her gut. She had done this. She had used their last dollar to drag her son to this godforsaken, forgotten corner of the world. They were trapped. No money for gas to go back, no signal on her phone to call for help, miles and miles from the nearest living soul. The isolation was no longer a feeling. It was a solid, impassable wall encircling them. Her throat felt tight and constricted, her chest squeezed by a rising tide of panic. She stumbled toward the front door and pushed. It refused to budge, swollen shut with years of damp. Gathering what was left of her strength, she threw her shoulder against the rotting wood. It groaned in protest, a long, agonizing sound of tortured timber and rusted metal. With a final, desperate shove, it shrieked open, scraping a deep gouge into the floor. The smell that rushed out from the interior was a concentrated blast of pure neglect, a musty, gag-inducing miasma of trapped air, mildew, and rat droppings. The darkness inside was nearly absolute, a chilling black void that seemed to hungrily swallow the weak afternoon light, promising nothing but more decay and more despair within its cold, silent heart. As her eyes slowly, painfully adjusted to the gloom, the full horror of the interior revealed itself. It was even worse than the outside had promised. The walls were weeping, streaked with grotesque, dark water stains that looked like maps of misery. A thick, furry, greenish-black mold climbed the corners, thriving in the permanent damp. The floor was a treacherous landscape of seemingly solid planks and dark, gaping holes where the wood had rotted completely away. In one corner, a pile of sodden, disintegrated leaves and debris marked where the roof had failed entirely, allowing rain to pour directly into the room. A constant, maddening drip, 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 echoed from a dark corner. The cabin's own slow, agonizing death rattle. There was no electricity, no running water, not a single sign of modern life. A rusted iron stove sat cold and silent in one corner, its chimney pipe disconnected and dangling uselessly from the ceiling. The only furniture was a single rickety wooden table and two mismatched chairs, both cloaked in a thick grey shroud of dust and what were unmistakably animal droppings. As Helen and Lucas took a hesitant step inside, a family of mice scattered with a frantic scratching sound, vanishing into a crack in the wall. A wave of visceral revulsion washed over Helen, making her skin crawl. Her stomach, already clenched with hunger, now twisted itself into a tight, nauseated knot of pure disgust. This wasn't a home, it was a hovel, a biohazard. She collapsed onto one of the dusty chairs, which let out a pained groan under her weight, as if it, too, was on the verge of giving up. The full crushing reality of their situation descended upon her like a physical blow. They had traded the slow, grinding death of urban poverty for the swift, brutal shock of total isolation and destitution. Tears she had fiercely held back for months finally broke free. They were not tears of sadness, but of rage and utter defeat, streaming silently down her face in the cold, damp air. In Pittsburgh, she had thought they had hit rock bottom. She was wrong. This place, this cold, dark, rotting hole in the heart of nowhere, this was rock bottom, and they were trapped in it. Lucas, seeing his mother finally break, walked over and placed his small and cold hand on her arm. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, a small, solid presence in the overwhelming ruin, trying to be strong for her. The simple, brave gesture was almost her undoing. She looked at his face, pale and smudged with dirt from the journey, and saw the raw fear in his eyes that he was trying so desperately to hide. In that moment, something shifted inside her. The last, dying ember of her fighting spirit, which had been extinguished by the sight of this wreck, suddenly reignited as a single, hard, angry spark. She wasn't just a widow. She wasn't just a failure. She was his mother, and as she looked around the dark, rotting tomb they were supposed to call home, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not the end. The first few days in the cabin were a slow, grinding torture that settled deep into Helen's bones. Survival became a bleak, mechanical routine. Mornings were spent searching for wood that was dry enough to burn in the rusted stove, a constant battle against the pervasive dampness that clung to everything. The rhythmic, grating sound of her sawing through wet logs became the soundtrack to their new life, a noise that spoke of futile effort and gnawing hunger. Afternoons were for patching. She used mud, leaves, and scraps of rotting canvas she found in a collapsed shed to plug the countless holes in the walls, a desperate and temporary defense against the wind that whispered through the gaps like a malevolent spirit. Every night they huddled together for warmth under their thin blankets, listening to the unnerving symphony of the forest, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, and the constant, maddening drip of water into a tin bucket. A cold, permanent ache had taken up residence in her joints. A week bled into the next, and the initial shock congealed into a state of chronic, low-grade despair. The gnawing emptiness in Helen's stomach was a constant, physical torment, a dull ache that made it hard to think, hard to hope. She felt her body weakening, the muscles in her arms and legs trembling with exhaustion after even the smallest task. But worse than the physical decay was the erosion of her spirit. She felt herself becoming as hollow and broken as the cabin around them. Her thoughts were a thick, grey fog of regret. Every splinter she pulled from her hand, every gust of cold wind that found its way through her threadbare sweater, was a reminder of her catastrophic mistake. A nauseating sense of shame washed over her whenever she looked at Lucas. She had led him here, to this forgotten place, to starve in the cold. The weight of her failure was a physical presence, pressing down on her chest and making each breath a conscious, painful effort. Her heart didn't just ache with sadness. It felt bruised, tenderized by a relentless barrage of fear and guilt. Lucas adapted with the silent E, heartbreaking resilience of a child who knows his world has been irrevocably broken. He spoke little, his voice a small, tentative thing in the vast, oppressive silence of the woods. He spent hours watching the forest from the one relatively intact window, his face a mask of solemn concentration. He learned to identify the calls of different birds and could tell by the shifting light when rain was coming. But his quietness was a heavy blanket over the cabin, a constant, unspoken testament to their isolation. Helen felt a fresh stab of guilt every time she saw him flinch at a sudden noise from the woods, or when she caught him staring at the meager pile of edible roots she had managed to gather, his hunger plain on his face. He never complained. His stoicism was an act of love, an attempt to protect her from his own fear, and it was a burden that no 10-year-old should ever have to carry. The sight of his small, thin frame made her stomach twist into a knot of protective fury and profound helplessness. The third week brought a storm of biblical proportions. It began not with a gentle pitter-patter, but with a sudden, violent roar, as if the sky itself had ripped open. The wind howled like a predator, a deep guttural moan that shook the flimsy cabin to its very foundations. Rain didn't fall. It came in thick, horizontal sheets, thrown against the walls with the force of a fire hose. The sound was deafening, an apocalyptic drumming that drowned out all thought. The familiar, rhythmic dripping inside the cabin quickly escalated into a chaotic chorus of leaks, each new one a fresh assault. The mournful whistle of the wind through the shattered windows became a high-pitched shriek. Helen felt a primal terror grip her, the kind that came from being utterly exposed to the raw, untamable power of nature. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature snaked up her spine as she realized the pathetic mud and leaf patches were no match for this onslaught. The forest was angry, and it was trying to tear their fragile shelter apart. The cabin, already a ruin, began to actively disintegrate. The main leak from the gaping hole in the roof, once a manageable stream into their largest bucket, transformed into a full-blown indoor waterfall that crashed onto the floorboards with a percussive, splashing roar. The sound filled the small space, a constant, thunderous reminder of their vulnerability. New leaks sprung from the ceiling with alarming speed, dark water stains spreading across the rotting wood like a fast-moving disease. Soon, there were dozens of drips, a cacophony of plinking and plonking sounds as water hit the floor, the table, their blankets. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and intensified rot, a nauseating combination that made Helen's head spin. She felt a surge of pure panic rise in her throat, hot and acidic. The floor was becoming a shallow pond, the water cold and black, reflecting the terrifying flashes of lightning that lit up the cabin in stark, ghostly strobes. This wasn't just a storm, it was an invasion. Helen moved with a desperate, frantic energy, a primal instinct to protect her child overriding her exhaustion and despair. "Lucas, over here!" she yelled over the roar, her voice sounding thin and weak against the storm's fury. She dragged their two threadbare blankets and their single remaining suitcase to the driest corner of the room, creating a pathetic little island in the spreading flood. She grabbed every container they had, the tin bucket, 2 dented pots, even their empty water bottles, and scrambled to place them under the worst of the leaks. It was a futile, hopeless task. For every drip she caught, 2 more seemed to appear, the feeling of the icy water soaking through the knees of her jeans as she crawled across the floor was a final, miserable indignity. Her hands were numb, her body shook with cold and adrenaline, and the sound of Lucas's teeth chattering behind her sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. This place was going to be their tomb. Huddled in the corner, trying to shield himself from the spray, Lucas was staring intently at the ceiling. He had been lying on his back, watching the dark, spreading stains for nearly an hour, his eyes tracking the paths of the water. While Helen saw only chaos and failure, Lucas saw patterns. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the din of the storm. "Mom," he said, pointing a small, trembling finger upward. "Look, that one." Helen, soaked and defeated, barely registered his words. She was listening to the sound of the cabin groaning under the strain, expecting the roof to collapse at any moment. "What, honey?" she asked, her voice strained, her focus on a new torrent of water pouring from a new crack. "That board," he insisted, his voice a little louder. "It's different from the others." He didn't know how to explain it, but in the flickering, chaotic light of the lightning, as he had noticed it, a single plank darker and cleaner than the ones around it, that didn't seem to have the same water stains. Forced to focus, Helen followed his pointing finger. She shielded her eyes from the falling drips and squinted into the gloom. At first, she saw nothing but a mess of rotting timber, but then, as another flash of lightning provided a brilliant, momentary illumination, she saw it too. He was right. One of the wide ceiling planks, about 3 feet long, was subtly different. While the surrounding boards were warped and blackened with moisture, this one seemed almost perfectly straight. Its edges were too clean, too precise, as if it had been cut more recently than the rest. And most telling of all, the water that streamed from the ceiling seemed to flow around it, not through it, as if it were sealed or seated differently. A tiny, forgotten spark of curiosity flickered to life within the cold fog of her despair. It was an anomaly, a detail that didn't fit the picture of uniform decay. She felt a strange pull, an inexplicable urge to understand this small inconsistency in their miserable world. Her rational mind screamed that it was nothing, a trick of the light, a pointless distraction when the entire structure was about to come down on their heads. She was cold, she was starving, and her son was shivering beside her. Yet the image of that one perfect, straight-edged plank lodged itself in her mind. It was a question mark in a room full of exclamation points of disaster. The feeling was so unusual, this flicker of intellectual engagement, after weeks of pure survival instinct, that it felt almost like a betrayal of her misery, but it was persistent. A strange, illogical whisper in the back of her mind told her she had to know. "Stay here," she ordered Lucas, her voice suddenly firm. She scanned the dark, flooded room, her eyes landing on the long-handled broom they had found in the shed, its bristles matted with cobwebs and dirt. A plan, or the ghost of one, began to form. A cold knot of fear and a wild, unfamiliar thrill tied themselves together in her stomach. She waded through the ankle-deep water on the floor, the cold shock of it a jolt to her system. The broom felt surprisingly heavy in her numb hands, a clumsy tool for a delicate question. She positioned herself directly beneath the strange plank, the dripping water plastering her hair to her forehead and trickling down her neck. She could feel her heart begin to beat faster, a heavy, rhythmic thud against her ribs that was distinct from the drumming of the rain. She took a deep, shaky breath, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and mold. Then, she raised the broom, the handle scraping against the low ceiling. She tapped one of the normal rotting planks first. The sound was a dull, sodden thud, the noise of dead, waterlogged wood. Then, she tapped the edge of the mystery plank. The sound was completely different. It was a sharp, hollow tock, the resonant sound of dry, solid timber. A shiver, completely unrelated to the cold, traveled the length of her spine. It was different. It was absolutely different. Taking a new grip on the broom handle, she placed the end against the edge of the plank and pushed. At first, nothing happened. The wood resisted, held in place by years of settled dust and grime. She felt a pang of disappointment. It was just a board, just another part of their prison. But then she remembered the clean edges, the hollow sound. She repositioned her feet, bracing herself on the slippery floor, and pushed again. This time with all the strength her cold or tired body could muster. For a heart-stopping second, there was a scraping, grinding sound of resistance. Then, with a sudden, shockingly smooth motion, the plank slid sideways. It moved almost silently, gliding into a space she hadn't known existed. A perfect, rectangular hole of absolute, pitch-black darkness opened up in the ceiling above her, a puff of dry, ancient air, carrying the scent of forgotten things, washed down over her face. It smelled of brittle paper, dry rot, and dust. Nothing like the wet decay of the cabin. For a long moment, Helen just stood there, staring up into the void she had created, the broom still in her hands. The roar of the storm and the chaos of the leaks seemed to fade into the background. The black rectangle in the ceiling was a portal, a place untouched by the storm that was destroying everything around them. It was a secret. The cabin had a secret. A wild, improbable flood of questions rushed through her mind. What was up there? Why was it hidden? Who had hidden it? The raw, animal fear of the unknown battled with a surge of adrenaline-fueled curiosity. The darkness was terrifying, promising spiders and rats and suffocating closeness, but it was also a mystery, the first thing in months that wasn't about hunger, cold, or despair. It was a loop, a thread, and she felt an overwhelming compulsion to pull on it, regardless of what might be at the other end. Her breath caught in her throat. She had to see. She had to know what was inside that darkness. "Lucas, bring me that chair," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "The sturdier one." She pointed to one of the two decrepit chairs that constituted their only furniture. It was a dangerous idea, a teetering, half-rotted piece of wood, but it was the only way. Lucas, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement, dragged the chair over, his small feet splashing in the floor puddle. The chair's legs wobbled precariously on the uneven floorboards. Helen tested it with her hand, pushing down on the seat. It groaned in protest, a sound of wood fibers straining to their limit. A part of her, the sensible, terrified mother, screamed at her to stop. This was insane. Climbing on a broken chair in a flooding, collapsing cabin to crawl into a dark, unknown space during a violent storm was the act of a madwoman. But the other part of her, the part that had been awakened by that hollow talk, was now in control. The possibility of discovery had become more powerful than the certainty of their misery. She handed the dripping broom to Lucas. "Hold this, and hold the chair as steady as you can. Don't let it move. Understand?" The boy nodded, his small hands gripping the chair legs with a seriousness that broke her heart. He understood this was important. Helen placed one foot carefully onto the dusty seat, her weight making the entire structure shudder and creak ominously. She felt the wood shift beneath her boot. Her stomach clenched, and a wave of vertigo washed over her. She paused, her hand braced against the wet wall, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. The cold draft from the opening above her chilled her face. She could smell the dust more strongly now, a scent like an ancient, forgotten library. She felt Lucas's small hands tighten their grip on the chair legs below, a small, solid anchor in the chaos. His quiet strength gave her the final ounce of courage she needed. She pulled herself up, her muscles screaming in protest. Her head and shoulders entered the opening, and she was plunged into a different world. It was a cramped, triangular space between the ceiling and the steeply pitched roof, a crawl space filled with thick, velvety darkness. The air was shockingly still and dry, a stark contrast to the violent storm raging just on the other side of the roof and the deluge in the room below. Thick, intricate cobwebs, undisturbed for decades, brushed against her face and hair, and she had to suppress a gag. The sound of the rain was muffled up here, a distant, rhythmic drumming on the shingles above her head. She fumbled for her cheap phone, its battery critically low, and switched on the flashlight. The weak, narrow beam cut a path through the suffocating blackness, illuminating a world of rough-hewn beams, joists, and a thick, soft carpet of grey dust that covered everything. It was like breaking the surface of the water and finding a hidden, silent world. A shiver of awe and terror ran through her. The crawl space was small, no more than 3 feet high at its peak, forcing her to move on her hands and knees. The rough, unfinished wood of the joists scraped her palms and snagged on her jeans. Each movement sent up clouds of ancient dust that made her cough, the particles glittering like tiny diamonds in the phone's beam. The air was stale and close, the smell of time itself. It was clear that no one had been up here for a very, very long time. The space felt sacred and forbidden, a pocket of history sealed away from the world. She felt like an archaeologist breaking into a long-lost tomb. Her heart pounded in her throat, a frantic drumbeat in the dusty silence. The sense of trespassing was immense, a feeling that she was disturbing a silence that was meant to be eternal. A sudden fear, sharp and specific, seized her. What if the person who made this was still here? She quickly swept the light around, her breath held tight in her chest, but saw nothing but dust and shadows. She crawled forward, her phone's light beam dancing nervously ahead of her. The beam swept across the dusty floor, catching on the skeletal remains of insects and the debris of forgotten decades. She was about to give up, to believe the hidden entrance was just a strange and pointless feature of the cabin's construction, when the light snagged on something in the far corner, tucked away beneath the lowest part of the eaves. It wasn't wood, it wasn't stone. It was a dark, geometric shape, something with a texture that didn't belong. A surge of adrenaline shot through her, sharpening her senses. She crawled faster, her knee catching on a nail, a sharp stab of pain that she barely registered. The object was larger than she first thought, a bulky bundle wrapped in what looked like dark, heavy fabric. It had been deliberately placed, carefully hidden in the most inaccessible part of the crawl space. Her fingers trembled as she reached out to touch it. The material was cool and slick, with a slightly greasy feel, oilcloth. It was waterproof, designed to protect its contents from the damp. This wasn't a forgotten piece of trash. This was a package, deliberately and carefully preserved. Her pulse was a frantic flutter in her neck. With trembling fingers, she began to work at the twine that bound it. The knots were old and stiff, and she had to saw at them with her thumbnail. Her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The silence of the crawl space was absolute, broken only by her own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of her heart. The sound of the twine finally snapping was like a gunshot in the stillness. She peeled back the stiff, crackling layers of oilcloth, her excitement so intense it was almost painful. The weak beam of her phone revealed what was inside, a heavy, metal box. It was black with age and splotched with patches of deep orange rust, but it was solid, heavy, and real. She dragged the box out from under the eaves. It was heavier than she expected, a solid, dead weight that spoke of dense contents. It was a simple strong box, about the size of a shoebox, with a heavy hinged lid and a thick, rusted iron latch on the front. There was no lock. For a moment, she was paralyzed by a new wave of fear. What if it was a trap? What if opening it triggered something terrible? The thought was absurd, a product of a mind stretched thin by hunger and fear, but it felt real in the suffocating darkness of the tomb-like space. She ran her fingers over the cold, pitted metal. It felt ancient, a relic from another time. This was it. This was the heart of the secret. Whatever story that strange plank in the ceiling had to tell, the answer was inside this box. She took one last, shaky breath, the dusty air filling her lungs, and placed her thumbs under the rusted latch. It was now or never. The latch resisted, seized by decades of rust. She had to use both hands, her muscles straining, her fingers slipping on the cold metal. With a final, desperate heave, it gave way with a loud, groaning shriek of tortured metal that echoed in the small space. The sound was a violation, an opening of something that was meant to remain sealed. Her heart leaped into her throat. Slowly, reverently, she lifted the heavy lid. The inside of the box was dark. She moved her phone, directing the dying beam of light into the interior, and then she forgot how to breathe. The light didn't just illuminate the contents. It was captured, multiplied, and thrown back at her in a breathtaking, brilliant explosion of warm, golden light. Her mind went completely blank. She was staring at a treasure from a fairy tale. The box was filled, almost to the brim, with small rectangular bars of dull, heavy, unmistakable gold. A soft, buttery glow seemed to emanate from them, a light that felt ancient and powerful. A choked gasp escaped her lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. It wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. Her world was one of cold, damp, and hunger, of counting pennies and selling furniture. A world of grey despair. This vibrant, shimmering wealth belonged to another universe entirely. Her hand, trembling violently, reached into the box. She hesitated for a second, then touched the top of one of the bars. The metal was shockingly cold and unnervingly smooth. It felt dense, solid, real. She wrapped her fingers around it and tried to lift it. The weight was astounding. A single, small bar was heavier than the entire rusted box. It was real. It was all real. A wave of dizziness, so intense it almost made her black out, washed over her. She leaned back on her heels, her mind reeling, trying to process the impossible sight before her. Gold, a fortune, enough to change everything, enough to escape. As the initial blinding shock began to recede, replaced by a thrumming high-frequency state of bewildered excitement, she noticed something else. The gold bars weren't packed tightly. There was a space at one end of the box, and in that space, nestled beneath the last row of gold épées, was another object. It was dark, and its texture absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. Carefully, she set the heavy gold bar she was holding back in its place, the clink of metal on metal sounding unnervingly loud. She reached into the box again, her fingers brushing past the cold, hard edges of the gold to touch the softer shape beneath. It was leather, old, dry, and slightly cracked, but unmistakably the cover of a book. She lifted it out. It was a journal, bound in dark brown leather, its pages thick and yellowed with age. The weight of it in her hand felt entirely different from the gold. The gold was wealth. This felt like something more. It felt like a story. Beneath the journal lay one more item, a slender bundle of papers, tied together with a pale blue ribbon that had long ago faded to a ghostly grey. She lifted the bundle out with exquisite care, terrified the brittle paper might crumble to dust in her hands. The top document was a land deed, its intricate, spidery handwriting barely legible in the dim light. Beneath it, she could see the edges of what looked like personal letters. The ink faded from black to a rusty brown. A faint, dry smell rose from the papers and the journal, the scent of old libraries, of dust and time and dried ink. It was the smell of secrets. She held the proofs of a forgotten life in her hands, a fortune in gold, a private journal, and a stack of legal documents. The question that had started with a single, odd plank of wood had now exploded into 1,000 new ones. Whose gold was this? What secrets did the journal hold? And who was the person who had gone to such great lengths to hide it all away in this dusty tomb? Back in the main room of the cabin, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind an eerie, dripping silence. The air was cold and clean, washed by the rain, but inside Helen's mind a hurricane of a different sort was raging. The rusted metal box sat open on the dusty table, a stark and impossible centerpiece in the squalor. The soft, buttery gleam of the gold bars seemed to mock the surrounding decay, a treasure from another world that had violently intruded upon hers. She sat on the edge of the less wobbly chair, her body trembling not from cold, but from a profound system-wide shock. Her stomach was a hollow, aching void, but the hunger was gone, replaced by a buzzing, high-frequency hum of disbelief. She couldn't take her eyes off the gold, yet she felt an inexplicable pull toward the leather-bound journal in her lap. The gold was an answer to her poverty, but she felt a cold certainty in her bones that the journal was the answer to everything else. A wave of nausea rose in her throat. This was not found money. This was a secret, and secrets, when she knew, always had a price. Her fingers, smudged with dust and grime, trembled as she traced the cracked leather cover of the journal. The material was stiff and cold, like old, dried skin. A faint, dry scent of vanilla and dust rose from the pages, the perfume of a life sealed away for decades. She could feel her own heartbeat, a frantic, heavy thumping in her ears that seemed loud enough to shake the fragile cabin. This felt more intimate, more dangerous than discovering the gold. This was an invasion of a man's soul. With a deep, shuddering breath that did little to calm her, she opened the book. The first page was filled with a tight, spidery script. The ink faded to a rusty brown. The handwriting was neat, disciplined, but there was a frantic energy in the way the words were crammed together, as if the writer were racing against time or his own courage. The name Arthur Miller was written at the top, and below it, a date, October 12th, 1968. Her late husband's great-uncle, a ghost, was about to speak. "He came to me today," the first entry began. "Silas Blackwood. He knows I have debts. He knows I fear losing my post. He is a man who smells fear on others the way a wolf smells blood on the wind. He did not ask," he informed. "He has a business proposition," he called it. "A way for me to secure my future and serve the greater good of the county." The words felt like honey-coated poison in his mouth. I listened, and I felt the trap closing around me. A cold sweat beaded on my brow as he spoke. He wants me to use my position as a park ranger, my knowledge of the backwoods and the old and forgotten property lines for his enterprise. I felt a profound sickness in my gut, a revulsion so strong I nearly choked. But I also felt the crushing weight of my own weakness. I have a family to think of, a reputation to maintain. So I listened. God help me, I listened to the devil and did not cast him out. Helen's own stomach churned in sympathy, a cold knot of dread tightening within her. She knew that feeling of being trapped. She turned the page, her fingers clumsy. The next several entries were a horrifying chronicle of a conspiracy unfolding in the deep woods around her. Arthur wrote of the social turmoil of the late 60s, of families leaving the area, of disputes over land as the Blackwood coal operation expanded relentlessly. His role became sickeningly clear. Blackwood would identify a parcel of land he wanted, often owned by a family for generations. Then Arthur, the trusted local ranger, would be sent to discover discrepancies in their old deeds or survey maps. Discrepancies he himself had been forced to forge. He described late nights with old maps and fresh ink, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the pen. The guilt was a living entity in his writing, a parasite devouring him from the inside. "I am a ghost in my own life," he wrote. "I haunt these families, delivering pronouncements of ruin disguised as bureaucratic process. The look in their eyes, it will follow me to my grave." The story of the gold came a few months later. Some families, the journal explained, refused to be intimidated. They knew their land was theirs and they fought back. For them, Blackwood had a different method. Arthur's entries became more cryptic, filled with terror. He wrote of night visits by Blackwood's men, of whispered threats that turned into overt violence, of families forced to sign over their deeds for a pittance or risk accidents. The gold was the extorted wealth from those who had tried to hide their savings. Nest eggs stolen from them before they were run off their own land. Arthur's job was to hide the evidence. "He brings me the boxes," one entry read, a frantic scrawl across the page. "Heavy with the tears of my neighbors. He trusts me to bury his sins in the earth because he thinks I am as soulless as he is. He is wrong. I hide it, yes, but I remember where every last ounce is buried. I am not his treasurer. I am his historian. His judge." Helen felt a chill snake up her spine. This wasn't just a fortune. It was a monument to immense suffering. Helen's hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the journal steady. The world had tilted on its axis. She was sitting in a crime scene, decades old, holding the killer's ledger and the victim's treasure. The weight of this knowledge was immense, a physical pressure on her chest that made it hard to breathe. The gold bars on the table no longer looked like a miraculous salvation. They looked like cursed artifacts, each one representing a family destroyed, a life ruined. She felt a wave of dizzying vertigo, the squalor of the cabin and the impossible wealth blurring together into a nightmare. Her own desperation, her own poverty, suddenly felt small and insignificant compared to the historical atrocity laid bare in these brittle pages. She looked at Lucas, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep in the corner, and a new kind of fear, cold and sharp, pierced her heart. This secret was not dead and buried. It was alive, and she was sitting right in the middle of it. With a surge of desperate energy, she turned to the bundle of papers tied with the faded ribbon. Her fingers fumbled with the delicate knot, a sense of dread mixing with a morbid need to see the proof for herself. She unrolled the documents on the table, their brittle edges threatening to crumble. They were exactly what the journal described, a collection of original land deeds, their paper thick and fibrous, and beside them, Arthur's forged copies, artificially aged with tea stains and fake watermarks, just as he had described in his tormented entries. There were also a handful of letters, confessional letters, written by Arthur, addressed to a federal prosecutor he was apparently too terrified to ever contact. They detailed everything, the scheme, Blackwood's methods, and included hand-drawn maps marking the locations of the stolen family homesteads, many of which were now part of the vast Blackwood mining empire. The truth was no longer just a story in a journal. It was here. It was physical, undeniable, and utterly terrifying. The sheer scale of the evil was breathtaking. Silas Blackwood hadn't just stolen money, he had stolen history, erasing families from the very land they had occupied for a century or more. He had used the law as a weapon, and a trusted community figure as his tool. Helen felt a surge of cold, hard rage on behalf of Arthur and his victims. It momentarily eclipsed her fear. The park ranger, trapped by his own weakness, had spent the rest of his life creating this time capsule of truth, a perfect package of evidence designed to one day bring a monster to justice. He had died before he could see it through, but he had left the weapon behind for someone else to find, and now that someone was her, a poor, widowed seamstress, trapped in the very woods where these crimes had been committed. The irony was so bitter it made her want to laugh, a hysterical, mad sound that she choked back before it could escape and wake Lucas. The responsibility felt like a physical weight on her shoulders. It was then that a sound cut through the quiet dripping of the cabin, a sound so alien and out of place it made Helen's blood run cold. It was the low, powerful rumble of a modern engine, growing steadily closer. It wasn't the sputtering groan of an old farm truck. This was a smooth, deep purr, the sound of money and power. A cold dread washed over her, immediate and absolute. No one came out here. The lawyer had said the cabin was isolated for miles. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, panicked rhythm. Her eyes darted to the box of gold and the scattered documents on the table. Without a second thought, she moved with a speed born of pure terror. She swept the journal and the papers back into the strongbox, slammed the heavy lid shut with a loud clang, and shoved the entire thing under the rotting table, kicking dust and debris over it to hide the edges. She grabbed a dirty rag and frantically wiped the tabletop, trying to erase any sign of what had been there. The engine sound was closer now, right outside. The engine cut off, plunging the world back into a sudden, profound silence that was somehow more menacing than the noise had been. Helen's breath hitched in her throat. She stood frozen in the middle of the room, her ears straining, every nerve ending on fire. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, her car door closed with a solid CMART expensive thump. It was the sound of precision engineering, a sound that had no business being in this world of rot and decay. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunched on the gravel and mud outside, approaching the cabin. Helen instinctively grabbed Lucas, who was stirring from the noise, and pulled him behind her, her body forming a flimsy shield. Her heart was a wild, terrified bird beating against the cage of her ribs. Then came the knock. Not a tentative rap, but 3 loud, authoritative knocks that shook the flimsy door in its frame. They were the knocks of someone who did not expect to be refused. Peeking through a wide crack in the wall near the door, Helen saw it. A gleaming black luxury sedan, its paint job immaculate even after driving down the muddy track, was parked where her own rust bucket rental had been. It was so out of place it looked like a spaceship. Standing on her collapsed porch was a man. He was old, easily in his 80s, but he stood ramrod straight. He wore a crisp, expensive wool coat, tailored trousers, and polished leather shoes, absurdly clean for the muddy surroundings. His hair was a shock of perfectly coiffed white, but it was his eyes that made the air freeze in Helen's lungs. They were pale, cold, and piercing, the eyes of a bird of prey, scanning the ruin of a cabin with an air of dismissive ownership. She didn't need to be told. She knew, with a certainty that turned her bones to ice, who this was. The name from the journal screamed in her mind. Silas Blackwood. Taking a shaky, silent breath, she forced her trembling legs to move. She opened the door just a crack, keeping her body mostly behind it. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice a dry, reedy thing she barely recognized. The old man's thin lips curved into a smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "Mrs. Miller, I presume. Helen Miller," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, yet carrying an unmistakable undertone of steel. "I'm Silas Blackwood. My family has been in this county for a very long time. I heard someone had moved into old Arthur's place. I thought I'd come by and welcome you to the neighborhood." The name, Arthur, from his lips sent a jolt of ice through her veins. He was testing her. A wave of nausea swept over her as she stood face to face with the architect of so much misery. She felt the weight of the hidden box behind her, a terrifying secret, burning a hole in the floor. "It's not much of a place," she managed to say, her throat tight. "We won't be staying long." "Nonsense," Blackwood said, his eyes scanning the ruin with faux sympathy. "But you're right. It's in a sorry state. Hardly a place for a lady and her boy." He gestured vaguely at the oppressive woods surrounding them. "This land, it can be unwelcoming. For outsiders." He then looked directly at her, his gaze sharp and penetrating. "Tell you what, I'll take it off your hands. It's part of an old parcel that connects to some of my family's holdings. For the deed, and to help you get on your way, I'll give you $500. Cash." The offer was so insulting, so ridiculously low, it was a slap in the face. $500 for land that held a fortune in gold and secrets worth infinitely more. It wasn't a real offer. It was a power play, a signal. He was establishing his dominance, treating her as if she were dirt on his shoe. Helen's heart pounded. He knew something. He had to. He wouldn't be here otherwise. He was fishing, trying to see what she knew. She stared back at him, her mind racing. The man from the journal, a figure of monstrous evil, was standing on her porch offering her pocket change for a king's ransom. A cold, defiant anger began to bubble up through her fear. She thought of the families he'd destroyed, of Arthur's tormented life. I'll have to think about it, she stammered, the only non-committal answer she could conjure. Blackwood's smile tightened, losing any semblance of warmth. He took a step closer to the door, and the air grew heavy with his unspoken power. The smell of his expensive cologne, a scent of cedar and spice, was overpowering, a stark violation of the cabin's natural scent of damp and decay. "There's not much to think about," he said, his voice dropping to a low, confidential and deeply menacing tone. "It's a generous offer, considering the circumstances. This is a very isolated place, Mrs. Miller." He let the silence hang in the air for a moment, his cold eyes boring into hers. He looked past her, his gaze falling on Lucas, who was peering around the edge of the door. Blackwood's expression didn't change, but Helen felt a primal surge of protective terror. Then he looked back at her and delivered the final chilling blow. "Things can go wrong out here in the woods. People get lost. Fires start. Accidents happen." He said the last words slowly, with deliberate emphasis. It was not a warning, it was a promise, a clear, unmistakable threat. He held her gaze for one more terrifying second, then turned without another word, his footsteps crunching deliberately as he walked back to his immaculate car. The door shut with another solid thump, the engine purred back to life, and the black sedan disappeared back into the forest, leaving Helen trembling in the doorway, the echo of his words hanging in the air like poison gas. The silence that descended was absolute, a crushing weight of terror and certainty. He knew. He didn't know what she had found, but he knew the cabin held a secret, and he was here to reclaim it. The journal was no longer a historical document. It was her death warrant. The gold was not a ticket to freedom. It was the motive for her murder. She was trapped, not just by poverty and isolation, but by a powerful, ruthless man who had killed before and would not hesitate to do so again to protect his legacy. The weight of the choice before her was suffocating. She could take the box and run, hoping to disappear before he came back, or she could stay and fight, using the evidence to do what Arthur never could, expose him. But that would mean putting herself and her son directly in the path of a monster. The threat was real, it was immediate, and she was utterly alone. What would you do in her place? Would you run, abandoning the fight for justice to save your own skin? Or would you risk everything, your life and the life of your child, for a chance to right a terrible wrong? For a long, terrifying moment after the luxury sedan disappeared, Helen remained frozen in the doorway, the ghost of Silas Blackwood's threat clinging to the damp air like a toxic fog. The woods, which had been a place of indifferent misery, now felt actively hostile, each shadow seeming to twist into a menacing shape, every rustle of leaves a footstep. Her heart was a frantic, trapped bird beating against her ribs, so loud she feared it could be heard miles away. A cold, paralytic fear rooted her to the spot. Her mind, a whirlwind of panicked thoughts, kept replaying his words, "Accidents happen." It was a death sentence, delivered with a polite smile. The weight of the rusted box hidden under the table was no longer a potential fortune. It was a tombstone, heavy with the lives of Blackwood's victims, and now, potentially, her own. The air felt thin, and a wave of dizziness made her grip the splintered doorframe to keep from collapsing. She was a mouse in a maze with a patient, well-dressed cat. The immediate, overwhelming impulse was to run, to grab the box and Lucas and just disappear into the vastness of America, to become another anonymous soul swallowed by the anonymity of a big city. But the thought died as quickly as it formed. Blackwood was not a man to be trifled with. He had power, money, and a reach that surely extended far beyond this forgotten county in West Virginia. The journal was proof of his ruthlessness and his thoroughness. Fleeing would only be a temporary reprieve. He would hunt them. He had a name, a face, and he knew they were here. A cold, sickening realization washed over her. There was no running from a man like Silas Blackwood. There was only confronting him or being erased by him. Her stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. She felt a surge of nausea so powerful she had to swallow hard against the bile rising in her throat. She was trapped, not by the woods, but by the secret she now possessed. The cabin was no longer a refuge. It had become a target. Her gaze fell on Lucas, his small face pale and his eyes wide with a fear he didn't fully understand, but felt in the marrow of his bones. He clutched her pant leg, his knuckles white. That simple, dependent gesture shattered her paralysis and replaced it with a cold, clear fury. This wasn't just about her. This was about her son. Blackwood had not just threatened her. He had looked at her child while delivering his promise of accidents. A primal, protective rage, hotter and more powerful than her fear, surged through her veins. She would not let this monster touch her son. She would not let Lucas become another forgotten victim in Silas Blackwood's long and bloody history. The decision solidified in her mind, hard and sharp as a shard of glass. She was not Arthur, the guilt-ridden ranger trapped by his own weakness. She had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The fear was still there, a cold, heavy stone in her gut, but now it was overshadowed by a fierce, unyielding resolve. But resolve was not a weapon. She was one woman, weakened by hunger and exhaustion, with a 10-year-old boy. Blackwood had men, power, and an entire county under his thumb. The feeling of utter helplessness threatened to overwhelm her again. She needed an ally. The thought was absurd. Who in this God-forsaken place would dare to stand against Silas Blackwood? The name from the journal was a curse, a name people likely only whispered in fear. Then, a memory surfaced, a tiny, insignificant detail she had almost forgotten. On the crudely drawn map the lawyer had provided, marking the path to the cabin, there was another small square drawn in pencil, about 2 miles east, with a single, faint word next to it, Abernathy. It was the only other sign of human habitation noted for miles around. It was a long shot, a desperate, insane gamble. This Abernathy could be another of Blackwood's pawns, or worse, a hermit who would shoot at them for trespassing. But it was the only chance they had. The decision was made in a heartbeat. Waiting was suicide. Blackwood had given her a veiled ultimatum, and the clock was ticking. "Lucas, we're going for a walk," she said, her voice strained but firm. She pulled the heavy metal box from under the table, the scrape of the metal against the floorboards sounding deafeningly loud in the silence. The sheer weight of it was a shock, a dead-wound physical burden that mirrored the moral weight she now carried. She found a tattered burlap sack in the corner, a relic from some long-ago delivery of feed or grain, and wrestled the box inside. The rough fibers of the sack scratched her already raw hands. The smell of old potatoes and damp earth filled her nostrils. She hoisted the sack over her shoulder. The weight was staggering. It pulled at her muscles, making her grunt with the effort. A cold dread settled in her stomach. 2 miles through the woods. Carrying this. It seemed impossible. But the image of Blackwood's cold eyes spurred her on. They slipped out the back of the cabin, avoiding the exposed front porch. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of slick, decaying leaves and hidden roots. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wet earth, an aroma that was no longer comforting but menacing. Every snapping twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot, every hoot of a distant owl like a warning. Helen kept one hand firmly on Lucas's shoulder, the other gripping the coarse burlap strap of the sack that dug painfully into her flesh. The weight of the box was a constant, brutal punishment, throwing her off balance, straining her back and legs. A cold, stinging sweat beaded on her forehead, and her lungs began to burn with the effort of drawing in the cold, damp air. Fear was a metallic taste on her tongue. She felt utterly exposed, a hunted animal moving through the predator's territory. Her own heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. The 2-mile journey was an eternity of pain and fear. The woods grew darker as the afternoon waned, the canopy of leaves overhead blocking out the fading light. Long, sinister shadows stretched across their path, playing tricks on their eyes. Helen's mind was a frantic loop of paranoia. She imagined Blackwood's men behind every tree, their eyes watching, waiting. The muscles in her shoulder and back screamed in protest, a fiery, tearing pain that radiated down her arm. More than once, her foot slipped on a patch of wet moss, and she nearly fell, the heavy sack threatening to pull her down into the mud. Each time, she caught herself with a choked gasp, the adrenaline surging, her grip on Lucas tightening. The boy was silent, his breath coming in small, terrified puffs of white in the cold air. His small hand clutching hers was her only anchor in a sea of fear. The physical agony was immense, but the terror was worse, a constant, chilling companion on their desperate pilgrimage. Finally, through a break in the dense trees, She saw it, a thin curl of wood smoke rising into the grey sky. It was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen, a sign of life, a sign of hope. As they drew closer, a small homestead came into view. It was a simple, unpainted wooden house, much like her own cabin, but leagues apart in condition. The roof was sound, the windows were glazed, and a warm yellow light glowed from within. A small, well-tended garden, now dormant for the winter, sat beside it. A sense of order and care emanated from the place, a stark contrast to the chaotic decay she had left behind. An old, tired-looking dog on the porch raised its head and let out a single, low woof, more of a weary announcement than a threat. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled her knees, washed over Helen. She had made it. She gently lowered the heavy sack to the ground, her muscles screaming in protest. Her entire body trembled with exhaustion and relief. An old man emerged onto the porch, drawn by the dog's bark. He was tall and impossibly thin. His frame stooped with age. He wore simple denim overalls and a flannel shirt, his face a roadmap of deep-set wrinkles. His eyes, however, were sharp and intelligent, and they regarded her and Lucas with a cautious, guarded curiosity. "Can I help you folks?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. He made no move to invite them closer. Helen's heart, which had just begun to slow, started hammering again. This was the moment of truth. She had to trust this complete stranger with her life. Her voice, when she spoke, was a raw, trembling whisper. Are you Mr. Abernathy?" she asked, her breath catching in her throat. She felt a desperate, pleading hope rise within her, a fragile prayer that she hadn't just led her son into another, more subtle kind of trap. The old man's gaze sharpened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I am," he said slowly, his eyes flickering from her face to Lucas, to the bulky burlap sack on the ground. "And who might you be?" The question hung in the cold air. The weight of her secret, of the gold and the journal, felt immense. She took a staggering step forward, her exhaustion and fear making her reckless. "My name is Helen Miller. I'm Arthur Miller's great niece. I've been staying at his cabin." At the mention of Arthur's name, a flicker of something, recognition, sadness, suspicion, crossed the old man's face. He was silent for a long moment, studying her, his gaze penetrating. Helen felt stripped bare, her desperation and terror on full display. "Please," she whispered, the single word a raw plea. "I need your help. I think I'm in terrible trouble." She knew she sounded unhinged, a frantic woman appearing out of the woods with a wild story, but she had no other choice. This was her last, desperate throw of the dice. Mr. Abernathy studied her for another long, agonizing moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, he gestured toward the door. "Get inside out of the cold, you and the boy. You look like you've seen a ghost." The relief was so profound, it was a physical sensation. Like a tight band around her chest had finally snapped. Inside, the cabin was the antithesis of her own. It was small and cluttered, but it was warm, clean, and filled with the comforting smells of wood smoke, brewing coffee and old books. A fire crackled merrily in a stone hearth, casting a warm, dancing glow over the room. He sat them down at a sturdy wooden table and placed 2 mugs of steaming black coffee in front of Helen and one of hot cocoa for Lucas, pounced without a word. The simple act of kindness was so overwhelming that Helen felt tears welling in her eyes. The warmth of the mug in her frozen hands was the first true comfort she had felt in weeks. She took a sip of the scalding coffee, the bitterness a welcome jolt to her senses. After they had warmed themselves for a few minutes, Abernathy sat down opposite them, his expression grim. "Now," he said, his voice low, "tell me what kind of trouble brings Arthur Miller's kin to my door looking like they've run through hell itself." Helen took a deep, shuddering breath. The story spilled out of her in a frantic, disjointed torrent: the discovery, the crawl space, the box and the gold. She felt a renewed surge of fear as she spoke the words aloud, as if giving them voice made the nightmare more real. Abernathy listened patiently, his expression unreadable, his pale blue eyes never leaving her face. When she got to the journal, she paused, her throat tight with emotion. She reached down, untied the sack, and with trembling hands, She lifted out the leather-bound book and placed it on the table between them. The moment felt momentous. No transfer of a terrible and sacred burden. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly as he saw it. Mr. Abernathy reached out a gnarled, weathered hand and touched the cover of the journal with a reverence that spoke volumes. "I'll be damned," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion Helen couldn't quite decipher. "I never thought I'd see this again." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a deep, ancient sadness. "Arthur showed this to me, you know, years ago. Not the contents, not all of it, but he told me he was keeping a record. He called it his confession and his judgment. He was a good man, Arthur, a weak man at a bad time in his life, but a good man at his core. He never forgave himself for what he did." The confirmation sent a tremor through Helen. This was real, Abernathy knew. He was the friend Arthur had trusted. She hadn't been wrong to come here. A single, hot tear of relief escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. The weight on her shoulders eased by a fraction, knowing she was no longer carrying it entirely alone. He opened the journal, his fingers tracing the familiar, spidery script. He nodded grimly as he read a few passages, a lifetime of unspoken knowledge reflected in his sad eyes. "It's all here," he murmured, more to himself than to her. The land grabs, the forged deeds, the way he ran good families off their own land. He looked up, his gaze hardening. "And it all leads back to one man, Silas Blackwood." He said the name like a curse, spitting it out with a venom that had been simmering for half a century. Then he looked at Helen, his expression grave. "You said he paid you a visit." Helen nodded, swallowing hard. She recounted the visit, the insultingly low offer, and the final, chilling threat about accidents in the woods. A cold, hard light entered Abernathy's eyes. He wasn't surprised. He was confirmed in a belief he had clearly held for a very long time, a dark suspicion that had festered in the silence of these woods for decades. "He's afraid," Abernathy said, a grim satisfaction in his tone. "The cabin being occupied after all these years has spooked him. He doesn't know what you've found, but he can't take the risk." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, the air in the small, warm room suddenly growing cold. "There's something Arthur didn't write in that journal, something he only told me in the last few weeks before he died. He was finally ready to do it. He was going to take this journal, the deeds, all of it, and go to the feds. He had an appointment. He was terrified, but he was finally going to clear his conscience." He paused, his gaze intense, drilling into her. He never made it to that appointment. The county coroner, a man who owed everything to the Blackwood family, ruled it a heart attack. Arthur was a healthy man. He didn't have a bad heart. The unspoken accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, and Helen felt a fresh wave of ice-cold terror wash through her. It was murder. Arthur hadn't just died of guilt or old age. He had been silenced. The final, horrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and the full monstrousness of Silas Blackwood was laid bare. He wasn't just a thief and a bully. He was a killer. A cold, calculated murderer who had eliminated the one man who could expose him and had it covered up with the casual ease of a man swatting a fly. The knowledge was a physical blow, knocking the air from Helen's lungs. Her own situation suddenly became infinitely more dangerous. She wasn't just dealing with a white-collar criminal. She was up against a man who would not hesitate to kill to protect his secrets. The threat of an accident was not hyperbole. It was a direct promise from a man who had made good on that same promise before. A profound, bone-deep chill settled over her, a fear so complete it felt like a premonition of her own death. Her life, and Lucas's, were hanging by the thinnest of threads. "We have to get this to the authorities," she said, her voice a desperate rasp. "Not the local ones, the feds, just like Arthur was going to do." Abernathy nodded slowly, his mind already working. "You're right, but we can't just walk into a police station. Blackwood owns this county, lock, stock, and barrel. The sheriff is his cousin. We'd disappear before the ink was dry on the report. We have to be smart. We have to be careful." He stood up and began to pace the small room, his movements surprisingly agile for a man his age. His mind was sharp, whirring with the possibilities, with the complexities of a fight he had clearly been waiting to join his entire life. He was no longer just a sad old man. He was a strategist, a keeper of secrets who had just been handed the weapon he needed, a spark of life, of righteous anger had ignited in his old eyes, burning away the years of weary resignation. "My son," Abernathy said suddenly, stopping his pacing. "My boy, Samuel. He's a lawyer, not some small-town hack, a real lawyer. Civil rights. Works for a firm in Washington, D.C. He's heard the stories his whole life about what Blackwood did to this county. He'll know what to do. He'll know who to call." The word lawyer sent a jolt of hope through Helen, a fragile but powerful current. This was it. A real plan. A path forward that didn't involve being found dead in a ditch. "The phone lines out here are all party lines. Old Tech, Blackwood's people could be listening. We can't make the call from here," Abernathy continued, his mind racing. "But I have a plan. Blackwood will be expecting you to run or to hide. He's impatient. He'll send his men back to the cabin tonight. I'm sure of it. We can use that." A plan began to form in the warm air of the cabin, a desperate, dangerous strategy born of necessity. He explained the layout of the land, the paths through the woods that only he and Arthur knew. The plan was simple, reckless, and their only option. Helen and Lucas would return to the cabin, but not to hide. They would prepare. Abernathy gave her a tarnished brass kerosene lamp, nearly full. "There's a pile of dry leaves and pine needles I raked against the north wall of the shed behind your cabin," he explained, his voice low and urgent. "When they come, you light it. The woods are damp from the rain. The fire won't spread far, but it'll make a hell of a blaze, a hell of a distraction. It'll draw them out. That's your chance." The smell of the kerosene was sharp and acrid, the scent of their desperate gambit. The cold, smooth glass of the lamp felt heavy and dangerous in her hand. She felt a surge of cold, terrifying resolve. She could do this. She had to. Her fear was still a living thing inside her, but now it had a purpose. While they're distracted by the fire, you grab the box and your boy, and you run. Don't use the path. Go straight through the woods, due east. I've marked a trail with white stones. It's hard to see, but it's there. It leads right back here. I'll be waiting. My truck is old, but it runs. We'll be miles away before they figure out you're gone. On our way to a payphone in the next state if we have to." He pressed a small, heavy flashlight into her hand. "The batteries are fresh. You'll need it." The plan was terrifying. It relied on timing, on luck, and on her ability to hold her nerve in the face of mortal danger. A tremor ran through her hands, but she fisted them, gripping the cold metal of the lamp and the flashlight. She looked at Lucas, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a strange, childish sense of adventure. She knelt down and looked him in the eye. "We're going to play a game of hide and seek, honey," she whispered, "but you have to be very brave and do exactly what I say." The walk back to the cabin was a journey into the mouth of the beast. Every shadow was a monster, every sound a prelude to ambush. The heavy box, which she had insisted on carrying herself, was once again a brutal punishment, but this time it felt different. It was no longer just a burden. It was a weapon. It was justice. It was their only way out. The woods were now pitch black, the flashlight beam cutting a small, lonely tunnel through the darkness. The air was cold and heavy with the promise of more rain. Helen's heart pounded a steady, heavy rhythm of dread and determination. She felt like a soldier heading into battle, her stomach a cold, hard knot of fear, her mind laser-focused on the steps of the plan. She rehearsed it over and over. Wait for the sound of the engine, light the fire, grab Lucas and the box, run. The simplicity of it was both terrifying and comforting. There were no other options. They slipped back into the cabin, the darkness inside even more profound and menacing than before. The smell of rot and mildew seemed stronger, the smell of a tomb. Helen didn't dare light the kerosene lamp. They sat in the cold, absolute darkness, waiting. The silence was a physical entity, pressing in on them, amplifying every small sound, the drip of water, the scuttling of a mouse, the frantic thumping of her own heart. She held Lucas close, his small body trembling against hers. She whispered Abernathy's instructions to him one more time, making sure he understood. "When I say run, you run, and don't look back." The minutes stretched into an eternity. The waiting was a unique form of torture, a slow-burning acid of anticipation and fear. Her senses were on high alert, her ears straining for the one sound she both dreaded and prayed for, the sound of an engine. Then it came. At first, it was just a low, distant hum, A vibration felt more than heard, but it grew steadily, resolving itself into the familiar, powerful rumble of Blackwood's luxury sedan, accompanied this time by the rougher, louder growl of a second vehicle, likely a truck. Helen's blood ran cold. The sound was different this time. It wasn't the sound of a polite visit. It was the sound of an invasion. Headlights swept through the trees, their beams slashing through the shattered windows of the cabin, throwing their huddled shapes into stark relief for a terrifying second, before plunging them back into darkness. She felt Lucas flinch and squeezed him tighter. Her breath hitched in her throat. The vehicles pulled up right outside, their engines cutting out abruptly, plunging the world into a sudden, menacing silence. Car doors slammed, not one, but three, four of them. He hadn't come back alone. Heavy, purposeful footsteps crunched on the muddy ground outside. They were moving with confidence, with menace. There was no knock this time. Instead, there was a loud, splintering crash that shook the entire cabin. They had kicked the door in. It flew open, banging against the interior wall, a dark silhouette of a large man framed for a moment against the faint moonlight. "Find the box!" A rough voice barked from the darkness. "Blackwood wants it now." Panic, hot and blinding, threatened to engulf Helen. This was it. The moment had come. Her mind went momentarily blank, her body frozen in pure terror. The sounds of heavy boots stomping through the cabin, of men tossing aside the flimsy furniture, the crash of the table being overturned, shocked her back into action. Now, she whispered to herself, the word a desperate prayer. She grabbed the kerosene lamp, her hand slick with cold sweat. With Lucas clutching her jacket, she scrambled toward the back of the cabin. The sounds of the men ransacking the main room were terrifyingly close. "It ain't here," one of them yelled in frustration. "Check the shed! Check everywhere!" Helen fumbled with the latch on the back window, her fingers clumsy and numb with fear. It was swollen and stuck fast. For a heart-stopping second, she thought they were trapped. She threw her shoulder against it, a surge of adrenaline giving her unnatural strength. With a groan of tortured wood, the window frame splintered and swung open, letting in a blast of cold, damp night air. Below the window was the shed Abernathy had described, and beside it, the dark, promising pile of dry leaves. She took a deep breath, the sharp smell of kerosene filling her lungs, and struck a match from the small box Abernathy had given her. The first one fizzled out. Her hands were shaking too hard. The men's voices were closer now, just outside the cabin, their flashlight beams cutting erratically through the darkness. "She can't have gone far," one of them shouted. Helen struck another match. This time, it flared to life, a tiny, precious flame in the vast darkness. She carefully lifted the glass chimney of the lamp and touched the flame to the wick. It caught instantly, blooming into a steady, yellow glow. She didn't hesitate. She shoved the lamp, flame and all, out the window and into the heart of the leaf pile. There was a moment of agonizing silence, and then a soft whoosh that rapidly grew into a roar. An eruption of orange and red light painted the side of the cabin, the fire catching faster than she could have imagined, devouring the dry pine needles with a hungry crackle. "Fire! Over here!" one of the thugs yelled, his voice laced with surprise and alarm. It was working. The diversion was working. "Now, Lucas, go!" she hissed, practically shoving him out the low window. He scrambled out, his small form a fleeting silhouette against the roaring firelight before he disappeared into the darkness. Helen grabbed the heavy burlap sack containing the box, the weight a familiar agony. She swung her legs over the splintered sill, the rough wood tearing at her jeans, and dropped to the soft, muddy ground outside. The heat from the fire was intense on her face, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke. The shouts of the two thugs, their dark shapes silhouetted against the flames as they stared at the blaze, confirmed they were completely distracted. This was her only chance. She grabbed Lucas's hand, and together they plunged into the absolute, disorienting blackness of the forest, away from the light of the fire, away from the only home they had. Her lungs burned, her heart hammered, and she ran, blindly, desperately, into the night. The darkness of the woods was total, a physical wall of black that swallowed them whole. Helen held the heavy flashlight Abernathy had given her, but she dared not turn it on yet, terrified the beam would give them away. They stumbled forward, guided only by the memory of the direction he had given her, due east. The ground was a treacherous landscape of unseen roots, slick mud and sharp rocks. She fell to her knees twice in the first 100 yards, the impact jarring her bones, the heavy sack slamming against her back. The cold, wet leaves plastered themselves to her clothes, and thorny branches whipped at her face and arms, leaving stinging cuts. Behind them, she could hear the enraged shouts of Blackwood's men as they realized the fire was a ruse. "They're gone! Find them!" The sounds of them crashing through the undergrowth spurred her on, a fresh wave of terror, lending strength to her screaming muscles. She risked a flick of the flashlight, the beam cutting a frantic, bouncing path through the trees. She was searching for the white stones Abernathy had described, the breadcrumbs that would lead them to safety. For a terrifying minute, she saw nothing but an endless sea of dark, identical trees. Her heart sank. Had she gone the wrong way? Were they lost? Running in circles? Just waiting to be caught? Lucas whimpered behind her, his small hand gripping hers so tightly it hurt. The sounds of pursuit were closer now, the snapping of branches and the curses of the men echoing through the silent woods. Panic clawed at her throat, hot and suffocating. Then, the flashlight beam caught it, a small, more pale shape on the forest floor, a white stone. A wave of profound relief washed over her, so intense it almost made her weep. She found another, 20 feet ahead. It was a trail, a real trail. Abernathy had not failed them. The escape became a desperate, lung-burning race from one stone to the next. The path was not a path at all, but a treacherous, winding route through the thickest parts of the woods. Designed by someone who knew how to move unseen, the weight of the box was a monstrous anchor, each step a new agony. Her vision blurred with sweat and exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. Lucas was struggling to keep up, his small legs pumping, his breath a high-pitched wheeze. The sounds of their pursuers seemed to fall back slightly as they followed the more direct, but noisier, main track. They were gaining distance. The hope, fragile and wild, was a painful stitch in her side. She could feel the cold, heavy metal of the box banging against her spine, a constant reminder of what was at stake. It was Arthur's legacy. It was the voice of the dead. It was her son's future, and she would not let them take it. They burst from the tree line like hunted animals, stumbling into the small, quiet clearing of Abernathy's homestead. The sudden silence was jarring after the cacophony of their own panicked flight. The only sounds were their ragged, desperate gasps for air and the frantic, heavy thudding of their own hearts. Helen's legs gave out, and she collapsed to her knees in the mud, the heavy burlap sack slamming onto the ground beside her. She was coated in a thick layer of mud and slick, decaying leaves, her face and arms cross-hatched with angry red scratches from thorny branches. Every muscle in her body screamed in a unified chorus of agony. A single, weak sob of pure exhaustion escaped her lips. Through the blur of her tears, she saw a figure emerge onto the porch. It was Abernathy, a solid, reassuring silhouette against the warm light of the house. He moved with a speed that defied his age, crossing the yard and gently taking the heavy sack from her. His touch was firm, his presence a silent promise of safety. The faint, acrid smell of old gasoline from his nearby truck was the sweetest perfume she had ever known. It was the scent of escape. Once inside the warm, wood-smoke-scented cabin, the adrenaline that had fueled their flight began to drain away, leaving Helen trembling with a bone-deep exhaustion. Lucas, his face streaked with tears and dirt, clung to her side, shivering uncontrollably. Mr. Abernathy didn't waste a second. He wrapped them both in thick wool blankets and thrust a steaming mug into Helen's shaking hands. "There's no time to waste," he said, his voice a low, urgent rumble. "We can't use my phone. We have to assume Blackwood's people are listening. We're taking a drive." He helped her to her feet, her body protesting every movement, and led them out to his old, dented pickup truck. The rusted door groaned in protest as he pulled it open, the sound of the old engine sputtering, catching, and finally turning over with a rattling roar was the most beautiful music she had ever heard. The truck lurched onto the muddy track, its headlights cutting a weak but determined path into the oppressive darkness. Helen clutched the cold, heavy metal box in her lap, a solid anchor in the terrifying, uncertain night ahead. The drive was a tense, silent blur of dark country roads. Mr. Abernathy hunched over the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes scanning the darkness with a grim intensity. Over an hour later, they pulled into a desolate 24-hour gas station just across the state line. The harsh and fluorescent lights of the station's convenience store felt alien, a sterile island of modernity in a world that had become primal and lawless. The smell of diesel fuel and burnt coffee hung heavy in the air. Lucas had finally fallen into an exhausted, fitful sleep in the middle of the bench seat. Abernathy got out of the truck and walked to the lonely, exposed payphone booth, its glass smudged and cracked. Helen watched as he fed a stream of quarters into the slot, the metallic clink of each coin a small, hopeful chime in the night. She saw him hunched over the receiver, his back to her, a lonely old soldier waging a war over a crackling phone line. She couldn't hear his words, but his rigid posture spoke of the immense gravity of the story he was telling. Her breath fogged the cold glass of the truck's window. The weight was agonizing. Each passing set of headlights on the distant highway made her heart leap into her throat with a fresh jolt of fear. Finally, Abernathy hung up the phone and walked slowly back to the truck. His face, illuminated by the green glow of the station's sign, was grim but set with a new and powerful resolve. "It's done," he said, his voice low as he slid back into the driver's seat. "Samuel is on it. He knows exactly who to call. People at the Bureau who specialize in this kind of thing, public corruption, historical crimes." He said to lay low, "Don't go back and wait for contact." A wave of dizziness washed over Helen. The FBI. The words sounded like they belonged to a movie, not to her life. They drove to a cheap, anonymous motel 2 counties away, the building's flickering neon sign promising a vacancy that felt more like a temporary stay of execution. Inside the room, which smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner, Helen stared at her own reflection. A bruised, gaunt stranger with haunted eyes stared back, but for the first time, there was a tiny, hard spark of a fight in their depths. 2 days later, 2 people who looked nothing like cops knocked on their motel room door, a man and a woman, both in their 40s, dressed in nondescript jeans and jackets, their expressions calm and unreadable. They introduced themselves as agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The moment felt surreal, dreamlike. They sat at the small, laminate table, and Helen, with Abernathy by her side, told the story one more time. This time, her voice was steady. She laid out the events with a cold yet clear precision, from the discovery in the crawlspace to the terror of the chase through the woods. The agents listened without interruption, their professionalism a soothing balm on her frayed nerves. They handled the leather-bound journal with white-gloved hands, photographing each page with a quiet reverence. The deeds, the letters, the hand-drawn maps, each piece of Arthur's desperate legacy was meticulously documented. The heavy gold bars were taken as evidence, their dull gleam seeming almost obscene under the cheap motel lighting. The weight of the secret, her secret, was finally being lifted. The agents explained the plan. It would be quiet, it would be fast. They wanted Silas Blackwood before he even knew they were coming. The news came not from a phone call, but from the small television in the corner of the motel room. A local news channel broke into its morning programming with a live report. The footage was shaky, shot from a distance, but the image was unmistakable. A convoy of dark, unmarked government vehicles had descended upon the immaculate Blackwood estate at dawn. Men in dark tactical gear swarmed the opulent mansion, and then there he was. Silas Blackwood, no longer in a tailored wool coat, but in silk pajamas, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock and impotent rage as he was led out in handcuffs. The image of the powerful, untouchable patriarch, the monster from the journal, now humbled and defeated, made Helen gasp. A single, choked sob escaped her, a sound of victory, of release, of justice for a ghost named Arthur. The quiet war was over. The story exploded across the nation. The Appalachian Gold, the headlines screamed. Decades of corruption uncovered in West Virginia. The arrest of a figure as powerful as Silas Blackwood sent shockwaves through the political and business worlds. Empowered by the federal investigation, other families from the county, long silenced by fear, began to come forward. Their stories, passed down through generations, corroborated every detail in Arthur's tormented journal, painting a devastating picture of Blackwood's reign of terror. The journal, once a private confession, became a public testament, its contents read into the official record. Helen and Lucas were kept in a safe location, shielded from the ensuing media circus, but she watched the news every night. She saw the faces of the other victims, Their stories finally being told, she realized she hadn't just saved herself, she had given a voice to a whole generation of the silenced. Arthur's guilt was finally absolved, his life's final, desperate act redeemed. The legal proceedings were complex, but the outcome was life-altering. Samuel Abernathy, his face beaming with a righteous victory, explained it to her. As Arthur's last living heir, and the person responsible for uncovering the vast criminal enterprise, the courts had awarded Helen a significant portion of the recovered assets, not just the gold she had found, but a portion of the wealth seized from Blackwood's illegal empire as restitution. He handed her a cashier's check. Helen stared at the number printed on the paper, her mind unable to process the string of zeros. It was an astronomical figure, a sum from a different universe. A memory, sharp and painful, flashed in her mind, her hands trembling. As she counted out the last $250 on a dusty apartment floor, the contrast was so violent, so absolute, that a wild, hysterical laugh bubbled up in her throat, quickly turning into a flood of silent, cleansing tears. For the first time she could remember, her stomach didn't hurt. She felt light enough to float. Months later, the air is not thick with the smell of mold and rot, but with the rich, savory aroma of roasting chicken and baking bread. The light is not the dim, grey gloom of a rotting cabin, but a warm golden afternoon sun streaming through the large, clean windows of a beautiful new kitchen. At a large oak table, Lucas, no longer a small, silent ghost, chatters happily as he draws in a sketchbook, his face relaxed and full of a light she thought had been extinguished forever. In a corner of the sun-drenched room sits a sleek, new sewing machine, a monument to her reclaimed identity. Helen sits down before it, her hands no longer trembling with fear but steady with purpose. She presses her foot down on the pedal, and the machine whirs to life with a quiet, powerful hum. The sound is a song of redemption, a rhythm of a new life. She guides a piece of bright blue silk under the needle, the stitches perfect and straight. She is no longer just a survivor. She is a creator again. She is home. Her journey had come full circle, but it had ended in a place she could never have imagined. With Mr. Abernathy by her side, she stood before a simple, elegant granite monument erected in the town square. Engraved on its polished surface were the names of every family Silas Blackwood had dispossessed, their histories reclaimed from the dust. The land around the old cabin, now legally hers, had been donated to a state park trust, named the Arthur Miller Memorial Forest, ensuring it would remain wild and protected forever, a quiet tribute to the man whose final act of conscience had changed everything. She had descended into the deepest circle of despair, a world of hunger, fear, and isolation. But through an act of impossible discovery and a will to survive, she had not only climbed out, but had pulled an entire community's history up with her. Her story became a quiet legend in those ancient hills, a testament to a mother's unyielding strength. If you were moved by Helen's incredible journey from desperation to justice and want to hear more stories of resilience and hidden truths, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss a new mystery.